It's 26 past the hour. Welcome back to Morning Joe. I have a question for you, Joe. Former Vice President Joe Biden claims that he does not need President Obama's endorsement in the upcoming election. That's not my question. My question's about this. Aboard his No Malarkey bus tour of Iowa yesterday, Biden told reporters that Obama's backing is not needed, even if he is one of the last Democratic candidates standing. Just backing up a little bit. No malarkey. Does that work? I mean, I kind of like it, I think.
And no malarkey's okay.
I guess, what is malarkey?
You know what? I think actually...
the Irish word for BS.
BS? Why can't it say no BS? I don't...
Because he's Irish, so he says no malarkey.
You know, I think actually it is a fantastic campaign slogan for Cork in like 1956. Yes.
Well, he's just embraced, he's owning it then. It's just like, that's what he's been saying.
You know, I'm a 50s guy. I go around saying things that dudes in their mid-80s say. Yes, he is owning it. He's putting it on the side of his bus.
But then I kind of like it.
I think it's okay.
Hey, listen, I'm a big believer in, you know, be true to yourself. And if that makes him more comfortable on the campaign trail, so be it, Jedi, which, of course, if I ever run a campaign, that's what I'm going to have on the side of my bus.
Oh,
so
great.
So be it, Jedi, with a picture of the Emperor, just like that. That sends a message. That's what I say to my kids every time they talk back to me.
Okay. So now I'll get to the story. When asked about a Politico report that Obama said the former vice president, quote, really doesn't have it when it comes to connecting with voters, Biden replied, quote, he may have said that, and if it's true, and he said it, there's truth to it.
Oh.
Okay. Biden told Bloomberg News that he was the one during their successful campaigns who was sent to key states such as Pennsylvania and Colorado to energize voters. Biden also dished about his fellow 2020 Democratic opponents, scoffing at the notion that Senator Elizabeth Warren is building enthusiasm and accusing Mayor Pete Buttigieg of stealing his health care plan. Okay.
All right, let's bring in the co-founder of Axios, Jim Vandehei. So, Jim, somebody apparently has spiked Joe Biden's milk of magnesia. This guy is coming out fighting.
Stop it.
You're on a roll this morning, Joe.
No. You know what I call it? No malarkey, lad. No malarkey.
We'll have a no malarkey exchange here. So, listen, I think Biden sees a couple things happening. One, with Elizabeth Warren, he feels like she made an epic mistake in endorsing Medicare for all without an option to keep your private insurance. So he's going to keep, I think, the foot on the gas on going after her. Pete Buttigieg, who he sees as the biggest threat in terms of somebody who could win over moderates and centrists, he knows that Buttigieg has a massive problem with African-American voters, particularly in South Carolina, but certainly even in polls nationally. And so he has every reason to be a little bit more aggressive and try to widen that gap between him and Buttigieg, him and Elizabeth Warren. And I think he's also a little irritated, right? Like, if you think about Bloomberg getting into the race, Bloomberg had basically called him early on and essentially promised he wasn't going to get in the race if Biden was in there. And now Bloomberg's in there and he's going to spend gobs of money, and that money's aimed at people Biden thinks that he should be able to win. So I think a little bit of this is offensive, a little bit of it is defensive. And in terms of the Obama endorsement, him saying he doesn't need it, it doesn't really matter because he's not going to get it. I think Obama's been very clear that he's not going to endorse anybody until it's a Democrat versus a Republican race.
So, Jim, what about the Biden strategy? How are they feeling right now? Which seems to be that, yeah, we're not doing great in the polls early in Iowa and New Hampshire, but those states aren't representative, and come Nevada, come South Carolina, then rolling into Super Tuesday, we're going to be fine sitting right where we want to be. We'll win big, the argument goes, in South Carolina, and that'll change the conversation. Yeah. Do they worry, though, that if Pete Buttigieg or Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders takes those first two states, they're in a tough hole to start off?
What Biden believes right now is that he probably is more confident now than he was 3 or 4 weeks ago. He feels like his theory of the case is proving to be stronger than the others, that the party's not as liberal as Elizabeth Warren thinks it is, that the voters in those early states are not as liberal as she is or Bernie Sanders. He thinks Buttigieg is a rookie who can't win minority votes, and so he feels like he is better positioned than the other four. What you said is the most likely scenario, that in those first 4 races, there's probably probably going to be a mix of winners. And that's why Michael Bloomberg's in this race, by the way. Bloomberg thinks it's just going to be a hot mess. People are going to win a state here and a state there, and that it's going to be wide open heading into that Super Tuesday. And he's going to do what billionaires do. He's going to spend, and he's going to pour a ton of money into ads, maybe more than all the other candidates combined. They're all going to be about him as Mr. Fix-It and Mr. Predictable, right, and hope that he can throw himself into the mix. And he had a bad entry. Listen, to start in the polls at 3, 4, 5% is not great, but he has spent now 30, 40, 50 million, whatever he has spent. And there is a slight uptick in the two polls that you saw yesterday. He's now at 5, 6%. And the question is, can he move up? I'm skeptical because he just seems like he's too centrist and too probably New York City for the Democratic Party that's looking for something new. But he's betting his reputation, in some ways betting his news organization on it.
Well, you know, Steve Ratner, obviously you've been very close to the mayor for some time. We'll just put that out there right now. But since he's gotten into the race, there's been a telling shift, at least in the last 2 weeks of November and the first week of December. Of course, the only thing that matters is what happens in February and beyond. But for now, at least, most candidates and even campaigns are starting to realize that the Democratic Party, that the Democratic base does not look like Democratic Twitter, that it's more like the Democratic Party that Reverend Al talks about, which is a conservative with a small c Democratic Party that actually looks down upon what we used to call limousine liberals, but what Reverend Al and a lot of people call latte liberals. It is a centrist party, which shouldn't be a shock, because every poll over the past 2 years has shown that Democrats want a more centrist candidate than they do a progressive.
Yeah, so a couple of things, Joe. First of all, it's not a coincidence that Mike Bloomberg waited till this relatively last minute to announce. As you know, he thought about it back in the spring, and his conclusion back in the spring was that there were too many strong candidates and there really wasn't room for him in the mix. As this has all unfolded, a bit along the lines of what Willie was going through, or Jim, this gets much more complicated, because at the moment Biden is polling 4th or 5th in New Hampshire and in Iowa. We all know that no Democrat has been nominated without winning at least one of those two states, and most of the successful ones have won both, except for Bill Clinton in 1992 when Tom Harkin was running in Iowa and Tsongas was running in New Hampshire. And so you're probably looking at a scenario, probably is an overstatement, but you're looking at a scenario where Mayor Pete and or Warren and or possibly Sanders could somehow split up Iowa and New Hampshire. Maybe Biden wins Nevada, maybe he wins South Carolina, but then he has Super Tuesday 3 days later. His campaign said yesterday that he'd raised $10 million in October and November. He raised $15 million in the third quarter and had $9 million left. He's going to be spending a lot of money in January and February to get through those early states. My point is that he could well be approaching a Super Tuesday where almost 45% of the delegates are going to be selected without the money to compete, not just against a Bloomberg, but even against a Buttigieg or Warren or Sanders, whose fundraising continues at a very robust pace.
You brought up Pete Buttigieg. He's releasing his first statewide ad in South Carolina today, entitled Welcomed Me. It's a part of the campaign's $2 million ad buy, which aimed to better connect Buttigieg with the racially diverse state. Here's part of the 30-second spot.
In our White House, you won't have to shake your head and ask yourself, whatever happened to I was hungry and you fed me? I was a stranger and you welcomed me.
When I say we've got to unify the American people, it doesn't mean pretending that we're all the same. It means unifying around issues from wages and family leave to gun violence and immigration.
Eddie, how's he doing as he's trying to sort of approach a segment of the population that polls show that he just suffers?
Right. I think the campaign is making a concerted effort. He just sat down recently at Greenleaf Christian Church with Reverend Barber in North Carolina.
Yep.
He's making.
How'd he do?
He did fairly well, I think. It's important for him to talk about these policy issues in a way that really speak to black communities. But I think we have to understand this in two ways. One is that he has to connect with black voters, and two, he has to be seen as someone who can deliver policy initiatives that will address the circumstances of black communities. That is to say that it's not just simply about appealing to emotion. It's not just simply about pandering to black communities. It's actually about policies on the ground. And I think this is really important, going back to our earlier discussion. When we use these political labels of liberal and progressive and centrist and conservative and the like, we might be, I think, overstating the matter. It might very well be the case that what people are looking for is change. Right, and that we're still in a change cycle, and the idea of political labels kind of defining how we want change may actually get us into some trouble. Yeah. And so you might have someone who's liberal, centrist, progressive, all of them want change. And so it seems to me that if Joe Biden doesn't understand that, if Pete Buttigieg doesn't understand that, if Elizabeth Warren doesn't, they're all going to find themselves in a situation.
And Jim Vandehei Axios is also looking at African-American men as a focus for Democrats. Tell us about it.
Well, yeah, I mean, the last election, you had African-American turnout decrease for the first time in 20 years, which is concerning for Democrats. And at the same time, you had 13% of African-American men vote for Trump. I think it was 4% of African-American women voted for him. And so you have a lot of the campaigns, Buttigieg, Booker, others who are reaching out specifically to African-American men to see if they can connect and also like jack up turnout, make sure that if there is higher turnout, that African-American men are voting for Democrats. And I think what Eddie said was really, really important. I do think that the biggest indicator of who wins nominations, who wins the presidency, are the people who are most sort of comfortable in their skin, who voters of all different types feel like are the real deal and are authentic. And people are much easier to sort of shift the shape of their ideology than we might think. I think that was the great lesson of Donald Trump. Look at all the things Republicans now believe that we would have thought unthinkable 4 or 5 years ago. I don't know that that dynamic is that much different inside the Democratic Party if the right person can connect, if the right person can seem like an authentic person who can beat Trump and lead to some sort of change.
All right, Jim Vandehei, thank you very much. And coming up, House Democrats get a small win in their fight for testimony from former White House counsel Don McGahn. We'll talk about that new court ruling. Plus, Congressman Duncan Hunter called the criminal case against him a witch hunt. But now the California lawmaker is set to plead guilty. Morning Joe's coming right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.